Good afternoon, everyone. It's Tracy Robertson. As Heather mentioned, I'm from the Ontario Trillium Foundation, and I'm the strategy lead for Prosperous People. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have an amazing panel that I think you'll really appreciate and learn a lot from. But before we hear from our panelists today, I'd like to provide a quick overview of our foundation and its our collective impact efforts. The Ontario Trillium Foundation's investment strategy focuses on 6 action areas, one of which is prosperous people, and each action area was developed from evidence-based research and guide our foundation in building healthy and vibrant communities. We're extremely happy to partner with Tamarack Institute to provide a series of free webinars as well with our collective impact stream. Our mission is to build healthy and vibrant communities by strengthening the capacity of the voluntary sector. We are an agency of the Government of Ontario, and each year we invest in $100 million in over 1,000 organizations. The collective impact stream, next. The collective impact stream meets our desire to help solve complex community problems in Ontario over the long term. We're very interested in helping co-designing impactful initiatives, providing capacity building services with our partner Tamarack, promoting learning between collective impact initiatives and hosting communities of practice around specific issues, providing funding and technical assistance for monitoring and evaluation. Really, we just want to support organizations through their journey. You'll notice on the slide that we have a collective impact grant program that brings fundamental change to our communities. And our collective impact model has 3 stages. We have define the impact, which is really a developmental phase. We have organize for impact, which is a planning phase. And we have deliver impact, which is an execution phase of the collective impact initiative. The details around the amount and timing of funding for each of phase can be found on our website, and I'll tell you how to get all the information that we have in a couple of slides. Our 6 action areas represent our vision and what we aspire to achieve. Our collective impact grants address issues related to all of these action areas that you see on the screen. So we have 6, from active people to prosperous people. And some of these issues for collective impact that we've been investing in over the last couple of years have been related to youth suicide, urban flooding, graduation rates, social integration, waste management, homelessness, which you'll hear about today, and physical activity. So the prosperous action area, if you move into next, is prosperous action area is about enhancing people's economic well-being by moving people from an area of crises so they're able to meet their basic needs to increasing their economic opportunity and moving them into a place of prosperity. Our belief and strategy is that everyone has the right and potential to contribute to the economy as long as resources are there to support them. So you'll notice that this slide has a Canadian Index of Wellbeing indicators at the top. The Canadian Index of Wellbeing was developed to measure the health and well-being of the community to complement the GDP. Each of our action areas, as I mentioned earlier, were chosen based on the alignment with 12 of the Canadian Index of Wellbeing indicators. Those are the ones that we have chosen from the framework itself, the national framework. For prosperous people, you'll see that we have 2 indicators that we are considering our North Stars. We're looking at what are those initiatives and systemic change, collective work that's happening to move the North Star and to achieve our vision. The 2 indicators, one is the percentage of persons in low income that we're shifting, and the other is related to the value of the Center for the Study of Living Standards Economic Security Index. The other areas, if you notice, we've articulated 2 priority outcomes within our action area, and that is increasing economic stability and increasing economic opportunity. Both of these also, our community collective impact initiatives would align with at least one of these outcomes. So any other information that we have, that I've identified here in the last few slides, anything on Ontario Trillium Foundation, what we fund, more information on the collective impact, you can get that on our website in front of you at www.otf.ca. You can also contact our support center, and you can contact Chelsea Cars, who's coordinating the collective impact effort, and our email's there. And you can also contact myself, the strategy lead. So now I'll just we want to move into our presentation, and I'm going to introduce our panelists. We're very excited to have both Melanie Redmond and Dr. Stephen Gates to speak with us about some fascinating work that they are doing with ending youth homelessness. They'll share their expertise and their knowledge. Melanie Redmond is the Executive Director of Away Home. Away Home is a national coalition with a 10-year mandate to mobilize stakeholders to prevent and end youth homelessness. Away Home utilizes collective impact and the constellation model to organize partners for maximum impact on the issue. In a short time, Away Home has become an international movement for change. Melanie currently serves as the chair of the Youth Homelessness Research Priority Area at the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. Her passion for addressing the root causes of complex social issues drew her to co-develop Away Home with partners across Canada. Welcome, Melanie. Our second panelist is Dr. Stephen Gates, Director of the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness and the Homelessness Hub. Dr. Gates is a leading international researcher on homelessness and is Director of the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness at York University. He focuses his effort on conducting research and mobilizing this knowledge so as to have a greater impact on solutions to homelessness. Stephen has played a leading international role in knowledge dissemination in the area of homelessness through the Homelessness Hub. Stephen co-developed Away Home, building on years of research, writing, and international engagement on the issue of youth homelessness. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I will move it over to the panelists so we can hear about the Away Home Coalition and the work that's happening. It has been happening for quite a few years, but also moving into the future and what's happening as the years are coming up. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think the first thing we need to do is shorten those bios. Thanks so much, Chelsea. Thank you, Heather.
Yeah, thank you so much. Let's go to the next slide. So we start with a question in the collaboration. You know, can we end youth homelessness in Canada? And what we're going to discuss today is why addressing youth homelessness really requires a collective impact approach. And we want to give you some concrete examples of how we're using it both at the national, regional, and local levels in Canada. And at the end, we'll have a chance to talk about lessons learned, because things often look nice and shiny from the outside, but there's lots of things that happen along the way that are as important. So next. In that effort to end youth homelessness in Canada, it's going to require us to do things differently. For the longest time in Canada, we've been working from the same kind of approach, focusing on just emergency services. And where youth homelessness shows up, it's often as an afterthought or a side dish in many communities. Often what happens is we take adult models, you know, the emergency shelter system, or even really good things like Housing First, and we just apply it to the youth homelessness problem by changing the age mandate. And the key point here is that to address youth homelessness, we have to acknowledge its distinctiveness from adult homelessness. The causes and conditions of homelessness for youth are quite distinct, and we need to take account of the needs of developing adolescents and young adults. Next. Which is what I just mentioned. But this is really important because it directs us to this key point, which is if the causes and conditions are unique, so must be the solutions. And that's the work of this project that we're on. And it's very exciting. We're delighted to talk about it because we are making some progress here. Next. The key challenge is to make a shift in Canada. This diagram here we use to show how you address homelessness. There are three things you can basically do. First, you can prevent a problem from happening in the first place, and that's important. Second, you're going to need emergency response because no matter how good your prevention is, bad things will happen. And third, you need to move people out of homelessness, so give them the housing and supports they need. I would argue in Canada historically, and this continues to be the case right now, the bulk of our investment and effort is in that middle part, right, where we're focusing on emergency services. We're now moving more proactively in the area of housing and supports through Housing First, which is an excellent intervention. If I were to redo this slide, I would make the prevention part really tiny. It's interesting, but in the homelessness world, there's a real reluctance in North America to talk about the role of prevention. So we need to change that. Next, we need to move from something that looks like this. Next, to something that looks more along these lines. That was magical. You see that? That's like a movie. Okay, this is where we want to get to. We need to rebalance things. We need to focus much more of our efforts and investment on prevention. We need to get people out of homelessness as quickly as possible with housing and supports, and we'll still need an emergency response, but we can't rely on that emergency response. The evidence now is just so overwhelming that if you allow a young person to remain homeless for any length of time at all, the exploitation, the damage to mental health and well-being, the addictions, all these things result. And so we have to change direction. Next.
So what are we doing about it? Next. So as mentioned earlier by Tracy, Away Home is a national coalition, and we utilize collective impact to help us move closer to really reducing the numbers of young people experiencing homelessness. Next. I think what's key, and I love telling this story for us, is to always be grounded in the experiences of young people with lived experience of homelessness. We took our name, Away Home, from a group of young people in Kamloops that were engaged in developing a strategy with their community to prevent and end youth homelessness. And they named their efforts Away Home, because they said there's more than one way home for every young person, and home means different things to different people. And since we launched as Away Home as a coalition a year and a half ago in Ottawa, we had to change our name to Away Home Canada, because people across Canada, communities, states in the US, Away Home America launched, Away Home Scotland is launching this fall. So people are really signing on to the movement. And what they're saying is that we want to address youth homelessness differently. We want to figure out prevention, and we want to work across the systems that drive young people into homelessness. Next. Next. So we have 5 strategic priorities, and I'm going to come back to these throughout the presentation. So I just want you to know what we're on about. Key in all of our work is really building an evidence base and shining the spotlight on what it looks like to prevent and end youth homelessness. And, you know, and often these things exist in small pockets, but it's about efforts to scale and make sure that these things take root in terms of policy, investment, and practice. Next. Next. This whole next thing, I'm going to be saying it in my sleep. Okay. So how we got here as a coalition, it's important to acknowledge that before 2012, there were a lot of organizations, national and local, doing really important work on the issue of youth homelessness. So we don't, you know, we don't claim credit that isn't due, and that's really important. So we were really fortunate. I was at EVA's Initiatives for Homeless Youth at the time, leading the national work, and we were really fortunate that the Catherine Donnelly Foundation supported a project that we collectively designed to support a number of pilot communities to develop comprehensive plans to prevent and end youth homelessness. And that was the Mobilizing Local Capacity Project. Now that created a space for us to start bringing members from government, youth with lived experience, youth homelessness service providers, researchers around a common table. And at that common table, we started talking about what it would really take to prevent and end youth homelessness in Canada. So we developed a collaborative vision paper, again, with all of those parties, and we did a mapping exercise of who was doing what toward that end, and what else needed to happen. Then we looked at what kind of a structure would serve us best. And we decided a coalition model would work well, but that we needed to formalize as an organization so that we could have backbone support, so that there was an entity driving the bus. And we always joke that sometimes we drive that bus with wine in our hand, but nonetheless, drive the bus. And then a lot of our work since has been really mobilizing what we know about youth homelessness through research and policy briefs. Next. I think I wanted to show this visual to really highlight that what we've done as a coalition is tried to create space for all of those different entities, including funders, including government, including service providers, the other national advocacy organizations on housing and homelessness to come together. And so we have our partnership model as a coalition, and then we have a national advisory where, again, we plug in all of those folks. And funders are really important in all of that work. Trillium included are part of Funders Together to End Youth Homelessness table, where we not only talk about investment strategies, but we also talk about what we can be doing collectively to influence policy. One example is when we launched the largest national study on youth homelessness ever without a home last year. Home Depot Canada Foundation hosted an event in Ottawa. And I'll tell you, the CEO of Home Depot can get meetings in Ottawa that most of us can't. And so that's been incredibly beneficial, that partnership, not only asking, funders to be at the table to give us resources to do our work, but to help us in terms of strategy, work alongside. Next. And so we organize our work. We use the constellation model from the Center for Social Innovation, and I'd had some experience with it previously with other projects, in a way to organize our work, but also to disperse leadership. Next. And we believe that our work as a coalition necessitates a collective impact approach. And so we're just going to quickly remind you, most of you have experience with this, but really point out a couple of things that we think are important here for youth homelessness. So it's the relevant actors from different sectors working together to address a major challenge. And what's really critical is that we're looking for a fundamental change at the population, for outcomes at the population level. So we want to drive down the numbers of young people experiencing homelessness, and if they do experience it, shorten the amount of time, and then make sure it never happens again. Those are fundamental changes at the population level. Next. This is where Steve takes over.
That's right. So why is the collective impact approach important in this case? We consider youth homelessness to be what we call a wicked problem. And a wicked problem is like a large and complex policy challenge in society that typically cannot be solved by a single organization or even a single sector. The complexity spreads across different domains and requires that collective response. It means changing the behavior of how organizations and individuals think. It means being able to work across boundaries, internal and external boundaries, to create linkages that will help us deal with this problem. Next. And we consider youth homelessness to be a wicked problem. It is not something that can easily be solved by, as I say, a single organization or even a single part of government. Next. What makes youth homelessness unique is that it is what we call a fusion policy issue. It's one that many parts of government and many institutions touch upon, both in terms of understanding the causes of youth homelessness, but also the solutions. Now, we've created a system or a structure, that emergency response, that relies on community-based nonprofit organizations to solve a problem that really involves health, mental health, addictions, child protection, the justice system, education. It covers a lot of different areas, and yet we've got a very narrow response to it, which is community-based organizations doing this work.
And I think it's also important to note that in our normal response, we haven't defined roles for unusual suspects. You know, when business leaders, private citizens, police officers, there are so many foundations, exactly. So if we work across not only the systems that drive young people into homelessness to help create the solutions, but also bring in those unusual suspects, and we have a stronger shot at impact on the issue.
And in fact, I don't think we can do it if we don't take that approach. So next. So how does this fit in terms of collective impact? If we just imagine now how most communities are organized around youth homelessness, it tends to include, as I say, nonprofit organizations, very well-meaning. I'm not criticizing the work that they do, but it's rarely a system approach, even internally. Often it's very fragmented. You'll have a number of day programs, number of emergency hostels, that kind of thing. They don't always work in a very organized, coordinated, or collaborative way, and often have even greater challenges in engaging mainstream systems like the healthcare, mental health systems, these kinds of things. And so what we have there is a case of, you know, and this is important, even when they work collaboratively, it's distinct from collective impact. And so what's the difference? If we look quickly on this diagram here, in that fragmented system, it encourages organizations to operate autonomously with perhaps some level of collaboration, but they basically work with their own agenda at heart. You know, I've got a board, I'm raising funds, we're trying to keep the organization going. Collective impact requires that organizations both within and external to the sector work towards a common agenda of change. Not more efficient service delivery, but changing the work. And that common agenda may collide with the agendas of the existing organizations. We have to work from fragmented measurements where each organization is doing its own thing to think about it as a system. We need to move from independent activities where you might have 10 organizations doing their own thing, lots of duplication, no gap analysis. We need to move to a system where we have mutually reinforcing activities. Again, both within the sector and connecting outward. We have to move from sporadic communication to continuous communication. So that's going to be important to bring everyone along so there's no surprises, and it reinforces what works and what's really strong in terms of collective impact. And then finally, we know from experience that this kind of work cannot happen if it's on the corner of a bunch of very busy people's desks. You have to have some entity that's going to help coordinate and drive through, and here it says backbone organization. I talk about backbone activities because it may involve more than one organization, but it is necessary to have some degree of coordination to drive things along, because change management as an issue, it's a difficult thing to do at the best of times. And if you, again, even people who are really motivated and well-intended, usually the day-to-day work usurps the change. So these are all key ingredients. Next.
So we're going to give you some examples from our work of collective impact and action. And then at the end, again, Tracy's going to facilitate a conversation where we can talk about some of the core challenges and learnings. Next. So a lot of our work as a coalition began with that initial supporting communities to do community planning work. And so that remains a core piece of work that we support communities and all orders of government to do. Now, one of the things that we do in a community when we go in is we encourage them to take a collective impact approach. And in Ontario, we've been quite fortunate to work alongside of the Youth CI program, which is a partnership between the province, Laidlaw, and McConnell Family Foundation, to be able to offer a lot of training, supports, implementation grants, et cetera, in the communities where my team work as content experts. And as you can see next, as you can see, there are a ton of communities in Ontario that are currently engaged in community planning, systems planning work, or they're poised to do so. Next. And to that end, the province of Ontario supported us to take our collective knowledge and learnings from outside of youth homelessness on systems planning from across North America and develop a community planning toolkit, which is free and open access for communities to use, because we believe that the difficult work in the community is the collective impact work. It is the change management, and it's not writing the fancy plan. The fancy plan, the elements are going to be the same in most communities. There are going to be some distinctions based on your community, but more often than not, where this work falls down is the changes that you have to make while you're implementing the strategy. Next. Another example, and you might want to talk about this one, Stephen, is our co-created research agenda.
Yeah, I think this is a good illustration of the constellation model, where Melanie mentioned before that each part of the constellation involves collaboration and leadership in the community. So next. So the research is a good example, because what we did is we've worked together with both the Canadian Observatory and Away Home, which both have extensive networks, have worked together to create a national youth homelessness research agenda. It's co-created, and this is really important. Researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and young people with lived experience have worked together to identify what is it we need to do research on, what is it we need to know, and why. And so this is really important. Rather than have one group or another make that determination, we determine it together and prioritize within. Next. So this is our current research agenda. It's important to note that we had our first agenda, I think, in 2014, and we checked off most of those activities. And so here's where we're at now. All of these are pointing to support the kind of changes we've been talking about to move from the crisis response to preventing and ending youth homelessness. So the Youth Homelessness Social Innovation Lab we're going to talk about later, but Melanie mentioned the Without a Home National Survey on Youth Homelessness, which has been already very influential in terms of driving policy and teaching us about what we need to do differently. There's one of the areas where we know we have to make changes in addressing youth homelessness is on helping make for better transitions from for young people who are in child protection care. And so we're focusing on an international summit. We're developing a prevention framework and a cost-benefit study that will identify, over the lifetime of a young person, what does it mean if we invest in effective interventions like Housing First for Youth? Next.
And note that we're going to be doing a second round of the National Survey on Youth Homelessness next year. That's why it's on the list currently. If you recall the strategic priorities I showed earlier on the screen for Away Home, that's really important to build the evidence base on models of prevention and Housing First for Youth. And so one of our first big projects to that end that utilizes a collective impact approach is in the area of school-based programs on the prevention side. Next.
And this is called the UPSTREAM project. And so it's a collaboration between Away Home, the Observatory, Raising the Roof, and the Push for Change. And
it has received some funding from Trillium through another granting stream. And this is an initiative like with our community planning work, where it necessitates in the community, at the community level, a collective impact approach.
And the idea for this project actually comes from Australia. It's worth pointing that out, right? Australia, unlike Canada, when their youth homelessness problem started to grow, they thought building emergency shelters was not really a good idea. They thought we should prevent youth homelessness, so they started to do work in schools. And this UPSTREAM project is an adaptation of a really successful school-based intervention for young people, and we're bringing it to Canada. And in Australia, in their application and development of this, they use the collective impact approach on doing this. And like us, say you cannot do this work at the community level unless you do that, because it requires the partnership between the youth homelessness sector, the schools, healthcare system, the researchers, etc. So they will stress just as we do how important this is. And so this is an interesting example on the ground of how we're taking that collective impact approach to solutions to youth homelessness. Next.
Okay, so here is a very exciting thing that's happened this year, big and exciting, and why I will be getting no sleep or vacation. Steve either. So making the shift. So next, making the shift has recently been funded by the federal government for phase 1, and is a partnership with Away Home, Mars Center for Impact Investing, Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and importantly, 2 provinces, 10 communities, and dozens of community partners. Next. Next, there. And again, this is all about building that evidence base, mobilizing the knowledge and resources, and then supporting government, all orders of government, and funders around policy and investment and scale. Next. And scale is a really important thing, and how we think about it. This comes from the McConnell Foundation, so don't tell them we forgot to put the credit at the bottom. I'll do that after this. But
it's there. It's just in white letters.
Exactly. So in order for any of these things to take root, these models of prevention and housing first for youth, and to take root and to really scale so that we fundamentally change how we're responding to youth homelessness, we have to think about scale in more ways than just how we normally do, which is replication, dissemination in numbers. We have to think about scaling up, impacting the laws and policy, and scaling deep, impacting the cultural roots. So how people think about the problem and how then people respond to the problem. Next.
Okay, so we'll give you a quick overview of what this project involves. Making the Shift is the name we've given to what is Youth Homelessness Social Innovation Lab. So it starts with collaboration, deep collaboration, and collective impact approach to addressing this major wicked problem. And there are 4 pillars of activity. The first we call insight and elevation, which is basically how do I identify what is innovative in the realm of prevention and ending youth homelessness. Most innovation stays very close to the ground, isn't described well, and isn't shared well. So we need to go out there, identify and evaluate what really we think is promising our works.
In policy and practice.
In policy and practice. Then the next piece we call demonstration projects in this case, but it's basically research and evaluation. How do we build the evidence base for these solutions? How do we know they really work? There's a lot of smoke and mirrors out there, and we need to be able to provide really good, solid research evidence for the effectiveness of an intervention. Once we've demonstrated proof of concept, then we need to develop resources to help with the dissemination. So this is to help government, funders, community understand the nature of the intervention and how to apply it. What are the resources that they need to do this? What is everything they need to know in terms of technical support? And then finally, mobilizing the knowledge. No matter how good our resources are, no matter how good they look, to shape and influence policy and practice, both in government but also in the nonprofit sector, that's a challenging issue. It's a relational one. So there are different roles for different people to do that work. All of this is to provide the knowledge, the conceptual knowledge, and the shift to enable the change to preventing and ending youth homelessness. All of this, and this goes back to the collective impact idea of what is it we're trying to change. We want to change that so that we can reduce the number of young people who are currently homeless and stop the flow into homelessness. Next.
And we'll just quickly show you on the screen through the next slide where we're doing the initial demonstration project. So Housing First for Youth is our Canadian adaptation of Housing First model. And then we'll be doing demonstrations in Ottawa, Toronto, and Hamilton. And the Indigenous project in Hamilton is Indigenous-led for Indigenous youth. Next. And then we'll be doing what we're calling family and natural supports program work. Some people were calling it Family First in the 7 big cities. in Alberta, and so that's family mediation work and providing supports to help young people enhance their natural support. Next. And then in Ontario, we're doing a demonstration project that, again, you can see what we've got. Actually, that slide is already shown. Next. And then important to note again that rigorous research and evaluation, including developmental evaluation, will be part of this process, because we want to understand what works and why, but also what doesn't work. And, you know, how are people overcoming the solution, the problems that emerge during implementation? Next. And you can put all these up. So this is our final slide, and then we can move to discussion. So how do we get there when we're thinking about scaling these efforts to prevent and end youth homelessness? Just to recap, we're building and supporting local coalitions using collective impact. We're supporting the implementation of models of prevention and housing first for youth, conducting rigorous research and evaluation, establishing that evidence base for government and funders, and supporting communities and all orders of government to scale and sustain efforts. And we're going to do it all by the weekend. Next.
Sure. We've got a lot of work to do the rest of the week.
Oh, that's a really good last slide.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you to both of you. It wasn't a lot of time, but because you had so much information, because you've been working on such great stuff at both local and systemic level. So here's a couple of questions that we have for the panel, and we want to hopefully address these in whatever way you feel would be helpful, because we want to get to the people on the phone. So first, what are the challenges that you're faced when you're using the collective impact approach yourself, or maybe even challenges that you know that communities are struggling with, especially with the issue of youth homelessness?
Okay, that's a really good question, and there are challenges. It requires a real shift in how people work together and how they think about their own organization. There aren't a lot of places in Canada where you see really on the ground communities in the nonprofit sector around homelessness working in a real integrated, collaborative way. And this is like the first step before you get to collective impact. And I always talk about this in terms of the specialness disease. I used to work in the sector, so I can say this not as somebody from the outside looking in. And what I mean by that is everybody works in an organization that they're proud of, generally speaking. The organization has its own culture, its own approach, its own history. And when I used to work in the sector, it was very common for people to say, you know, we're the ones doing all the heavy lifting on this issue. Everyone else is creaming or taking the easy approaches. And communities, and so it becomes hard to work together, right? You're driven by your board. As I said before, you're driven by the need to raise funds. You're driven by the need to feel proud of where you work. And so we really need to change the way people work together and think. The other piece is, and this is one that's ongoing, and we bump into this all the time, and it's a tough one too, and this is about credit, right? Who gets the credit for something? And once you start thinking about this, you'll see this everywhere. You know, people want to claim that they're the best, they're the first, they're the innovator, and everyone else isn't. And so when you're doing things together, that often comes up as like, well, this was our idea, and now you're using it. And so that's a challenge because, again, it cuts against the way we've been taught to work and think within organizations. What is more important than claiming credit is sharing credit, and we should always do that. So it's kind of like putting individual and organizational egos aside.
And I've got two things, Tracy. So one, it's built on what Steve said. People often claim that they're a collective impact initiative, and they'll say, we've been doing that for years. But what they're really talking about is collaboration. And it's really important that we celebrate collaboration, because to get some jobs done, you need collaboration. But to get other jobs done, like these wicked complex social problems, we need collective impact. And so it's really important that we keep bringing communities back, bringing individuals back to what those key differences are and why they matter. And then the other thing that's actually a really big deal is getting to a place of shared measurement. When we're talking about something like youth homelessness, we can start to see at the community level, moving to a place of shared measurement to truly be a collective impact initiative is possible. And we can get there, and we're making strides in that area. Now, at the provincial and national levels, that's a little more difficult. And so Steve and I and some colleagues have been doing a lot of thinking and work around this with our partners in government. So what does it look like to get to shared measurement? Because, you know, we can support communities to do collective impact work, but until we get there as a way home, I would argue we are not a collective impact initiative as a coalition.
And that shared measurement piece, if I can give you an example of what that means on the ground, it's really important. What you will find is that within communities and even within organizations, there's not always clarity about the outcomes you're looking for through your program model. And if you don't have clarity and if there isn't agreement about what you're trying to do, it's going to be really hard to work collectively. Housing First, for example, in some quarters, the only outcome that people care about is the person housed or not. And when we're working with youth, if we took that approach, we would probably set ourselves up for failure. But we need to get people to agree that other things are important as well. Social integration, wellness, meaningful relationships with adults, involvement in school or employment. These are also important outcomes, but we can't naturally assume that everyone agrees. So coming to a common sense of what is it that we're trying to change, how will we know that it's changed, and what data collection and management tools will help us do that at the organizational and community and national levels. Then we'll be able to really see what's working and move the dial and actually be able to demonstrate impact.
Great. Thank you. We only have a couple minutes left. I wonder if you could just identify maybe a couple of key learnings that you'd like to share or give advice.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think, you know, it's been a wonderful experience looking through everything through the lens of collective impact, because it is what is necessary with this issue. I think some of our greatest moments have actually been in co-creating solutions with members of government. And, you know, it's wonderful. We often think about advocacy as, you know, we want more housing, and that's really important, you know, to take that approach. But sometimes you also want to sit down with government and co-create those solutions together. They know there's a problem. We don't have to tell them. And so I think that's been an area that's been really fantastic. Key learnings, working with the funders in a different way. You know, I still run into folks all the time that say, you know what, the funder's a little too involved in my work. They need to just give me the money and get out the way. And they use that accent as well, a little bit of hip swagger. But if we think about a collective impact approach, it necessitates working with the philanthropic sector in a different way. Steve, do you have anything to say?
Yeah, I think at the community level, one of the exciting things is to see the different approaches people take to collective impact. Like what organizations assume leadership? How do they who do they bring to the table and why? And when I say leadership, I don't mean in a singular sense. I'm talking about dispersed leadership too. Like, where does that leadership lie? How do they overcome challenges? All these things we're talking about, the taking credit. There are different examples in different places. So it shows that if you get some smart people together, committed people, the change can happen. But one caveat on that, right? Because one thing we do not want to leave people with the impression is that this is by any means easy, or that it requires a silver bullet solution, or that it doesn't require constant tending like a garden.
And now I want to add to that something about momentum. Because one of the things we've learned is, especially at the community level, it's really easy to lose momentum And so we've been supporting communities to really think about focusing on early wins that they can mobilize around. So, you know, and biteable chunks, and then celebrating those wins as they come. And there are different strategies you can take. There's something called a 100-day challenge where, you know, you set a goal for the community and you work toward that one goal, like we're going to house with supports 50 young people in 100 days. You get the landlords, the police involved, you get the schools, the service providers, young people. And so there are ways that we're learning to push through that loss of momentum.
Great. Okay, thank you. I'm going to just shift it now over to Heather and to see if there's questions from the participants, attendees.
Hi, everyone. Melanie and Steve, this was an awesome presentation, and I learned so much. And coming from the healthcare sector, we were talking, when you talk about, you know, the emergency, which is for the healthcare sector, is the hospitals, and a lot of the funding and everything goes into that and not prevention. So I totally understood and got what you were saying, and do hope that we could take this model and put it into the healthcare sector so that we can prevent people from having to use the hospitals. So we do have several questions, and one of them is how you would add cultural identity to collective impact lens and maximize the inclusiveness for sustained impact.
I think that that's an excellent question, and we think about that a lot. What we can't do is assume that difference does not exist or is irrelevant. And in fact, we embrace that in a very direct way. I'll give you, we'll give you a clear example here. We know in Canada that Indigenous people are greatly overrepresented in homelessness, and including youth homelessness. And so when we're looking at doing demonstration projects on Housing First for Youth, one of the projects we're doing is an Indigenous-led model in Hamilton. And so on the one hand, around collective impact, we think it's really important to develop programming that meets the needs of people who are marginalized for multiple reasons and intersecting reasons, so LGBTQ, Indigenous youth, et cetera. But it isn't just one way that we have to create, through collective impact, specialized and targeted programs. What we're really recognizing is that it goes the other way as well. The Indigenous ways of knowing are very powerful and should in fact be incorporated back into how we think about Housing First for Youth generally.
And collective impact.
And collective impact, right? And one of the things that we've thought about in terms of collective impact, based on us learning more, and it's not that we've got this figured out, it's going to be through our lives, is that there are a lot of aspects about Indigenous ways of knowing that really speak to collective impact. All the notions of humility and of thinking together, you know, and grounding things in that kind of trust issues and things like that. I think one could do an amazing piece of work around collective impact through an Indigenous lens, and we would all benefit from it. So these kind of things are really close to our hearts, but also close to our brains, because we can't deal with these issues unless we take these kinds of approaches.
Mm-hmm. So this question, and I hear this doing collective impact work for the past 2 years around partners. So, you know, how to get the right partners at the table, and how to get them when you have different mandates and objectives and resources. So I know you guys have engaged a diverse spectrum of partners. How did you do that?
First, I always say coalition of the willing. Start out there. So there are some folks you may not bring along, but you may once they see the success of what you're trying to achieve together. I think it also goes back to those early wins. So I think if you're having a challenge getting the people around the table and getting excited to work together, I think you may want to choose something that you could all do together that's time limited, so you can start to build those relationships and trust. because that is, the relational is critical in all of this. And so for us, we're just, as I mentioned before, we were really fortunate to be given some resources to convene around a project. And that opened all of us up to inviting more people to the table as we identified the folks that not only wanted to be there, but also, you know, were from a place where they could affect change. And then, yeah, people are just excited to be on board. We're contacted constantly by folks that say, I want to get involved, plug me in.
And some of this work is really hard work too, because in moving into this place of saying we want to prevent and end youth homelessness, there were organizations and structures who considered that they owned the space already, that they were doing this, and in fact, they weren't, right? And so there's a lot of engagement between organizations to, you know, and that's part of that taking credit piece to overcome, to really kind of work with people towards a goal, undo ways of thinking and doing things, right? And then there are other organizations who saw youth homelessness as not being that important, and they have since moved along and now see it as important and that kind of thing. So it's like, again, some of the elements of collective impact, that continuous communication, engagement, addressing the challenges, working on the taking credit, getting everybody, at the end of the day, you can always appeal to people, what are we here for, right? It's not about your organization or mine, it's about solving this problem, because, you know, people won't like to admit it, but sometimes the organization and its goals and its viability actually does trump the actual issue you're trying to solve, and we have to get people to, you know, what are we trying to solve here? Let's come back.
And you have to give people, on the practical end, you have to give people ways to plug in.
Right.
And so the whole design of Away Home as a coalition, but also the constellation model, is so that we have spaces for people to plug in their expertise and energy, because a lot of momentum gets lost when, you know, you don't return emails or calls with people excited to get on board.
And the other thing I think is, as you go along, like, there's an evolution. So where you start and who you have around the table at the beginning, what you'll find is some who you thought would be peripheral actually kind of become much more important and engaged, and others that you thought were going to be key kind of fade away, right? So there's that evolution as well, which is actually healthy, and through time you land on a tighter group of organizations, individuals, to make progress. And that point about plugging in is really important. You have to have different processes and ways of engaging people, because not everyone wants to sit on a committee or participate in those kind of formal structures, but they still want to be part of it and learn from it and engage and be heard. And this is a real key learning we have around youth homelessness, or engaging young people with lived experience, right? That we really, you know, throwing young people on the board because we think that's a good way probably isn't for most youth. But there are lots of important ways to really draw on the experiences and make people feel valued and committed and interested.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really love that coalition of the willing. I love it. I think it's something that's going to stick with me. And then another tool that will help with this is the stakeholder wheel, where you can map out where people are, and eventually you can see those people who are on the peripheral will want to slowly come into the core.
That's right.
And yeah, and so that tool is available on the Tamarack website, but it's also going to be available on the Ontario Trillium Foundation website. And that's a really great tool in terms of mapping out. I'm going to take this one last question. I know we're right at time, but this is kind of building on what we talked about. And you guys talked about the unusual suspects, and this comes up a lot too, is how to engage the private sector. Do you have, in like 60 seconds or less, some tips on how to do that?
Well, if we, use Home Depot as an example, if you ask the head of the foundation what was the compelling argument that brought them over to work with us on youth homelessness, they'll say it was hearing, Dr. Gates and myself tell them in separate meetings repeatedly that it is possible to prevent and end youth homelessness, and we know how to do it.
And speaking to their supplier network, right? Like speaking not just to Home Depot, but they're connected to, like, as you can imagine, somebody's making those hammers. Right?
Exactly. But so all that to say, establishing a vision of change and a vision that's a collective vision. I think that was key for some of our private sector involvement. The other thing, it's just like with engaging government as well. You have to show them that your issue is their issue. So, for example, there's a funder that we're a private sector partner that we want to bring to the table, and they keep saying, well, we're interested in education and employment, and we're like, well, so are we. And you show them how youth homelessness and education and employment, where they intersect and why it's so very important. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that those are really good examples. Another one would be just around employment, and there's a program called Higher Up that we're working with that's going to be supporting us on the demonstration project. And what it does is it connects private sector employers directly with young people who need employment, right? So like that's the kind of a role that's important. Rather than just sort of like sending young people out to find work, we try to recruit employers to work with young people with a full understanding of that there may be challenges because young people, if they've experienced trauma or whatever, need different kinds of support. But there's different ways of thinking about it. And Melanie's point is like, figure out what makes them tick, what they want to do, because often people are looking for ways in to help and figuring out what that might look like.
And also, it's important sometimes not to ask for money, right? Like you want to think about partnerships at many different levels when you're thinking about the philanthropic sector and the private sector. Maybe your initial engagement has no ask attached to it other than, you seem to be connected to this issue. We'd like to have you at the strategy table.
Yeah, I say I learned to drink a lot of coffee.
Yeah.
A lot of conversations, a lot of coffee talks to build that momentum up. Okay.
We find wine and beer to be a little more helpful.
That's usually when you get creative in your conversations. Thank you very much, Melanie and Stephen, for sharing your insights and perspectives with us today. And many thanks to all of you for joining us. Your comments and questions have helped make this a dynamic and thought-provoking conversation. On your screen, you can see some more upcoming webinars that we're doing with OTF. We do have a 5-day event that Tamarack is running in beautiful Vancouver. And then you can go to our website to get some more information. So thank you, and like I said, we will be, we did record this, and in a few days I will send out a post email with the recording, and I'm also going to attach that toolkit that you talked about, Melanie, a link to it for people to get to, and that is it. So thank you very much, and it is raining here in beautiful Brantford, so I hope you guys enjoy a beautiful rainy day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.